Hi, I'm Jim Knotts, President and CEO of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund. Welcome to today's virtual reading of the names. 2022 marks the 40th anniversary of the dedication of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. As part of our commemoration, we'll host an in-person reading of the names at the wall from November 7th through 10th, 2022, when all 58,281 names on the wall will be read aloud. In the lead up to that event, we'll be reading names each day online while sharing the photos of these heroes. For our daily virtual reading, the names of the service members will be read by month and day of death between the years 1956 and 1975 in alphabetical order for the given day. We apologize in advance for any mispronunciations. Know that our readers are doing their best to honor these service members. We hope you'll listen and watch each day and share with others as we remember and honor those who gave their lives during the Vietnam War.
Ronald Lee Aylshire, Larry Michael Allen, Edward James Anders, Richard Robert Antonovich, Robert Lawrence Armand, Gerald Francis Ayres, Vernon Howard Baker II, Robert Lee Ball, Walter Ward Becker, James F. Barry, Barry Allen Bidwell, Peter Vincent Blazonis, Leroy Anthony Bourgeois, Frank Bowens, Clarence Bowman Jr., Michael David Boyer, James Patrick Brady, Thomas John Brennan, Johnny Charles Bresno, Robert Dennis Brown, Vernon Brown Jr., George Robert Browning, Robert Butler Buchanan, Terry Wayne Buckler, Larry Wayne Burdett, William Davidson Burt Jr., James Cabarrubio, Luis Xavier Cabrera Jr., Sam Canada Jr., Ramon Pena Kensel, Timothy John Carolyn, Robert George Carr, George Dare Carr, Fergus Joseph Carroll, Dennis Lee Casey, Philip Castillo, Edward William Charles, Rafael Albert Chavez, Alvin Peter Christensen, John Joseph Cimarelli Jr., Craig Michael Clancy, Henry Patrick Clark, Richard Milton Cole Jr., Sidney McLean Connolly Jr., Audrey Julius Cook, James Alton Cowan Jr., Frank Cruz, Roy Jerry Curry, Mark Giles Danielson, Ronnie Dean Davis, Robert Clark Dawson, Raymond Vince de Blasio Jr., Gerald Glenn Dedmore Jr., James Edward Degnis, Jose Manuel de la Torre, Harry G. Deal, James Richard Dolvin, Charles William Dornan, Donald David Douglas, John Tillman Dozier II, Carl Wilson Drake, Paul Default, Dale Don Dwyer, Michael Lee Earp,
Charles William Emmert, Enrique Thomas Enrico, Robert Clarence Ewald, Elmer Lee Faulkner Jr., Robert Matthew Fegan, Henry Lee Fisher, Jerry Fleming, Ronald Dean Fogard, Peter Francis Fonda, Clarence Jean Foreman, James Monroe Gehrig Jr., Jimmy Farrell Gentry, Leroy Clyde Geyer, William Terry Gibson, James Thurman Gibson, Paul Ferris Gilbert, Calvin Golden Jr., Basilio Gomez, Edward Francis Goshorn, Harry Dale Gowan, Robert Lee Graham, James Arville Green, Alan Heald Greenlaw, Lon Paul Gregorash, Walter Joe Lewis Griffin, Ronald Keith Grooms, Barry Richard Grulk, Eugene Richard Gudaswitz, Edward Joseph Guillory, Ernest Hardiman Jr., Elton Otis Harris, Robert Herman Harrison, Carlton Philip Hastings, Harold Frederick Hawkins, James Cornell Hurd, James Dale Hennessy, Marcos Hinojosa, Richard Lawson Hicks, Michael Leonard Hodge, Donald Robert Hoffman, Roy J. Holmgren, James Don Honeycutt, Percy Ray Howell, Leon Andrew Hunt, Charles Lewis Hunter, Paul Thomas Hurt III, Carrie Lee Johns, Clayton Henry Johnson, Gary Lee Johnson, Norman Jones Jr., William Jones Jr., Littale Jordan Jr., Claude Charles Cassiah, Scott E. Killingsworth, Larry Ronald Kilpatrick, James Edward King, Donald Herman Klink, Walter Joseph Krause Jr., Bobby Ray Lane, James Joseph Lane Jr., Charles Russell Lauer, Stephen Bruce Levine, Amos David Lawson, Stanley Lawrence Lerck,
Leroy Leland Jr., William E. Lemons, Gary Wayne Letson, Dennis Michael Longo, Anthony Ray Love, Terrell Gordon Lowry, Howard Joseph Maynor, Lionel Lucien Marcarell, David Joseph Marsh, James Alfred Marshall, James Michael Matthews, Randy Lee Matthias, Eddie Lee Malden, David Wayne McConnell, Robert Kenneth McCorvey, James Clifford McKittrick, Harry Lawrence McLam, Martin Allen McZeal, Edward Howard Meeker Jr., Wesley Eugene Melton, Jacob Edward Mercer, Hollis Gregory Miller, Robert Louis Mingle, Enrique Miramontes, Melvin Lamar Mize, Clarence Vernon Mobley, Jose Roberto Moncayo, Rudolph Pino Munoz, Dennis Gerard Murphy, Michael Anthony Najarian, Paul Reyes Narvaez, Thomas Daniel Naughton Jr., William Edward Neville, Larry Jerome Newman, Richard E. Nyhoff, Royal Preston Oden, Stephen Orozco, Elwood Owens, Andrew Jose Pacheco, John Robert Painter Jr., Frank Brennan Parrish, Andrew Dayton Parker Jr., Carl Arthur Paulino, Dan Leon Pfister, Michael David Pinkerton, Arthur Quesada, Harold W. Rodabaugh II, James Alvin Ravencraft, William Elbert Reed, Paul Allen Resendiz, Michael Wayne Richardson, Albert Fred Roberts, Harold James Roberts Jr., Joe Carroll Robertson, Roberto Rocha Jr., Gary Charles Salanitro, James Russell Salisbury, Randy Stephen Schell, Darrell J. Schmidt, John Rodney Schurer, James Arthur Scruggs, Frank Leroy Settle, Rito Silva, Richard Allen Skaggs,
Roderick Allen Skanes, Joseph Frederick Smith Jr., William Keene Stoll Jr., Stephen Ray Stoltz, Melvin Harold Suthens, Keith DeGarro Taylor, Albert Russell Taylor II, Calvin Lee Terrell, Earl Thomas, Charles Blake Thomas, Charlie Vance Thompson, Solomon Eugene Thompson, Bobby Ray Trapp, Edwin Ray Travnicek, Ralph Morgan Triplett, Barry Glenn Tucker, Edwin Francis Turk Jr., Stephen Frederick Turner, Philip Robert Venekamp, Nathaniel Wade, Eugene Kenneth Wallace, Frank Peter Watson, Mark Andrew Wenzel, James Edward Werderman, Thomas Michael Wharton, Donald Emery Witters, Thomas Allen Willard, Dieter Eric Willert, Robert Allen Wilson, Daniel Andrew Whitco, Roger Earl Witt, Robert M. Woods, Frank Charles Zonar Jr.,